Well, hello again, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to part 2 of Love at First Like. Our topic for this part is going to be deception. Now, I want to remind you, as we talk about online deception here, that we're only scratching the surface, just like we will in all the parts. There's a lot more out there about online deception, but this is meant to give everyone a taste to the topic and to hopefully inspire some thought and some discussion. Now, before we start talking about deception, there's a few questions here that I'd like you to consider and to think about as we get into talking a little bit about deception. First, and this one is one that I think is usually the way people think about it, what are the characteristics of the internet and social media that you think make lying easier? Now, one that maybe you haven't thought about before that I'd like you to think about is what are the characteristics that make it harder, do you think? And then finally, I'd like to ask, how common do you think lying is online? So take a couple minutes before you move on to the next slide and give these questions some thought. Now, the first characteristic of social media that many people think about when they think about what makes it easier to lie is the lack of nonverbals, or really the lack of visual information about another person. It's the fact that you can't really necessarily see for certain who the other person is that you're talking to. Now, of course, it's certainly hard to argue that if we think about the Monty Teo case, that this would have happened face-to-face. Now, it's not impossible, but pretty unlikely that someone would have been able to pull off this kind of deception if Monty had been able to see them from the start. So there's no doubt about that. And this is the one, too, where when we think about detecting lying especially, we often think that this is what we use, right? And if I ask you how do you tell if someone's lying, like it says, you'll probably tell me that you look at their eyes to see if they're looking you in the eye, you look to see if they're fidgeting, and you look at their other body language, their tone of voice, these kinds of things. So my guess is you would suggest that you need these things, or at the very least these things are very useful in detecting whether or not somebody's lying. Now, the first question I would ask about that is, can we fake these things? Can we fake some of these kinds of nonverbals in order to effectively convince people that we're not lying? And the idea is that, and it's commonly thought that we can. It's this idea of nonverbal leakage, that these things just come out. But, of course, a skilled liar who knows, for example, that you're looking to make sure that they're looking you in the eye is going to probably make sure that they look you in the eye when they talk about stuff. Now, along with the possibility of using those nonverbals against somebody, it's also important to consider whether or not we're actually able to use these kinds of things to detect deception. Although it's commonly thought that this is what we use and that we're good at this, more recent research on deception detection conducted by Tim Levine and others suggests that we're actually not very good at using these kinds of nonverbals to detect other people's deception, to see if other people are lying. These things actually then possibly might get in the way. So it's one of those things where we think we use these things, and we do use them. What I mean to say is we think we're good at using them, when it actually seems like these aren't what we really use effectively to tell if somebody's lying. So although we think this lack of nonverbals might be something that really helps lead to people lying more and being successful at it, maybe that's not actually the case. Now, another characteristic of CMC and social media that I think people think leads to increased deception and increased lying is something known as disentrainment. This is a concept that Walther in 1996 has discussed as well. Now, before we talk a little bit more about disentrainment, I will ask that you click on the link that's provided on the slide and watch this short video. Now, you may or may not remember seeing this. That made the news, and it was a big deal for a lot of people. Now, the question I want to ask is, would that have happened online? And probably not, is my thought, and it's because of this idea of disentrainment. Disentrainment is the notion that when we interact online, we're kind of able to break. At least one thing we're able to break from is the time constraints that happen face-to-face. In face-to-face interaction, if a person asks you a question, you have to answer it pretty much immediately. If you break and wait for 15 minutes before you answer that question, you know how people would look at you. I mean, think about it. If you asked someone a question and they took that long to answer it, what would you think? So even if you're not really ready, even if you haven't planned through your answer and thought through your answer, you have to respond immediately. Now online, you don't have to do that. You have the ability to take more time and to think through and to plan what you want to say. And of course, as part of that planning, it does at least offer the possibility for increased deception. Now those are both a couple of possibilities for characteristics that make lying easier in social media. Are there ones that might make it harder? Obviously, I wouldn't ask the question if I didn't think so. The first one I want to talk about is publicness. Especially in social media, obviously you're putting things in public. You're posting things on Facebook, for example, on Twitter, that go out to a lot of people to see. Now, not necessarily everyone in the world. If you've got privacy settings set up, then maybe only a select number of people can see that. But the question I'll have for you, and for those of you who are on Facebook, I'll ask, how many friends do you have? Think about it for a second. Who is all in your social network? 50, 100, 500, 1,000? Of course, it depends on who you are. How many of those people know you? Not everyone, maybe, knows you super well, but my guess is many of the people that you're friends with on Facebook know you pretty well. The reason I ask this is if you think about posting something, posting a lie or some other mistruth, we might say, on a site like Facebook, you have a lot of people who are going to possibly see it, who know you, and who know that it's a lie. Do you think that you'd be able to convince all of those folks to make sure that they don't call you on that lie? Maybe so, but to the extent that you can't, it certainly seems to suggest that lying might be harder online given those circumstances. Now, another characteristic that might make lying harder through social media and other forms of CMC is the permanence of it. When you post something on Facebook, it doesn't go away. It's there for people to see and for the people to access later on down the road. So how do we really typically detect lies? Again, a lot of people seem to think that we use nonverbals and look at body language and things like that. But going back to the research that I talked about earlier from Levine and others, they would suggest that one of the main ways we actually detect lies is by basically figuring out that what someone said at one point in time doesn't match up with what they're saying now. So somehow they leave an information trail or a paper trail, so to speak. Well, that's basically what we're doing consistently through social media. If we're putting stuff up that's permanent for the possibility of anyone to access it later on down the road, it would suggest, I think, that we have the very strong possibility of being caught in that paper trail. And this kind of suggests something that I want to bring up here at this point in time. I often hear people suggest that, online we can be anybody. And certainly there are characteristics, the things that make it easier, that might allow for that to be possible in ways that it never would have even been possible face-to-face. The question, though, that I want to ask is how long do you think you could get away with being, quote-unquote, anyone online? Because it takes a lot of work, and it probably takes a lot of effort, and there are things there are characteristics of the channel, the publicness and the permanence, that might make it harder to pretend to be anyone online, especially for any length of time. So, the next question we want to bring up is how frequently do people lie online? I think the common notion is that people lie all the time online. Now, that may or may not be true. But I want to address a couple things first that fall under the heading or the question, are lies that we perceive always lies? The first concept I want to talk about that I think falls under this idea is known as the Foggy Mirror. This notion comes from Nicole Ellison and some of her colleagues, and some of the research they've conducted on dating profiles. Now, if you look at this picture here, this is a great demonstration of the notion of the Foggy Mirror. You have a person who doesn't match what they see in the mirror. Obviously, the person that's looking back at them is not the same person that we see from the outside. This kind of typifies this notion of the foggy mirror. I might suggest that kind of the main point or the main question that we would look at in this notion of the foggy mirror is something a lie if we ourselves believe it? So obviously in the picture before, we can look at the person and see a certain person. But when that person looks in the mirror, they see something completely different. So, if a person believes themselves to be something, even though the rest of us don't necessarily see the same thing, are they lying when they talk about it? I think this is something that could account for at least some of the quote-unquote deception that we perceive online. We see people a certain way. They don't necessarily see themselves that way. Now, is that a lie if they then put that out there? Now, at this point in time, I'd like to suggest that this notion of the foggy mirror, this might be a point for more discussion. So this is something I'm looking forward to discussing more in our various discussion forums. Another concept that I think it's important to talk about and bring up here is this notion of the true self. In some ways, this is almost, you can see this is the flip side of the foggy mirror. This is one where we might ask whether or not something is a lie if it's true, but other people don't believe it. So, for example, if you know yourself and you know a certain characteristic of yourself, but it doesn't get a chance to show itself when you're with other people, does that make it a lie? And there are those that have suggested that this true self can come out more online. Some research conducted by Barg and his colleagues have suggested that because of some of the characteristics of the channel that we've talked about before, earlier, and even in probably part 1 of this MOOC, you're better able to be free and to be yourself online. It just so happens that, for example, in face-to-face interaction, that self doesn't get a chance to show itself sometimes. For example, you may know people who appear very introverted, when you talk to them face-to-face, especially in group settings. But when they get online, they're able to, be more extroverted. Is this a lie? Well, it's possible that the channel allows for people to plan, as we mentioned before, the possibility of disentrainment, and feel more comfortable talking. It's also possible that when you're in a group setting, for example, with multiple people, you only one person, for example, can talk at once. And you've probably seen that many times in these kinds of groups, one person ends up dominating the conversation. And some people don't feel comfortable then bringing things up. But given the lack of restrictions that sometimes social media and CMC can provide, it allows people to have that come out. Now again, is that a lie? Well, probably not. And I would also suggest that this may also account for some of the quote-unquote deceptions that we see in social media and in other forms of online interaction. So, how prevalent or how common is lying online, especially in social media? Especially if we compare it to face-to-face interaction, because that's certainly a question that we could bring up. Lying might be really, really common online, but is it more or less common than face-to-face, for example? For some more insights into the answer to that question, I will ask you to click on the link here and watch the video of Jeff Hancock, a scholar from Cornell University, discussing online deception. He'll give you some more insights into that, as well as some of the other things that we've mentioned so far in this part. That's all that I'm going to talk about here, at least in this part for deception. I'm hoping and looking forward to discussing more of this more, and I'm also looking forward to talking to you again in part 3.